Welcome back to the Symposium for Inclusive Philanthropy. Hopefully we will have folks join us, but we're also recording. We'll try to put this out on the website because these are some important topics that we plan to discuss today. Not the sexiest of topics, but important to all of the work here at Unfunded List. And for some of us, it's pretty sexy. I mean, depending on what you're into. I want to welcome our guests, Maria, Alex, and Ian. They are all capable of running a panel themselves without much help from me. So I will hand the mic over to Maria, who should unmute herself before she starts.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for joining. I first met Dave because my nonprofit IssueVoter actually had submitted proposals to the Unfunded List, and the feedback we received was super helpful. And in kind of a last minute decision, I decided to create a short little presentation for my introduction. Don't worry, it's not long. It's going to be like, less than 5 minutes, but I thought I'd give you a little bit of background about what IssueVoter does leading into our discussion today, and really wanted to emphasize the importance of policy. So just to introduce myself, I grew up with parents who always voted. My dad fled a country where democracy doesn't exist. So growing up, I think the value of civic engagement was always really important to me. This picture is actually of me and my mom voting this November. And then I was a campaign manager in Iowa, which is a state, as you all probably know, is very known for its participation in civic engagement, especially heading into the presidential election seasons. And so through that experience, it was really eye-opening because I had only lived in non-swing states before that. I had mainly lived in California, Texas, and New York. So being in Iowa, where people get so much access and exposure to the candidates, was really great. But what it also helped me realize was in Iowa, just like everywhere else, people are not necessarily as engaged throughout the year when, as Alex knows, the real work that affects our lives is getting done. And so that was a problem that I saw, and one where I, was trying to solve that through IssueVoter. So I'd invite you all to, think about an issue that you care about. And I would say that whatever that issue it is, there is policy that can create the structural, long-term, large-scale change that you would want to see with the issues that you care about. I think there are people out there, maybe not necessarily people who are attending this panel, but there are people out there who, feel pretty distanced from policy. They might care a lot about education, but forget, that's, highly affected by policy, or they might care a lot about the economy and, not necessarily think about the policies that are being passed throughout the year that affect that issue. Something I always tell people is Congress will introduce, Alex is on the Senate side, but on the House side, Congress will introduce over 15,000 bills each session. They'll vote on about 1,000 of them. We hear about maybe 1 or 2 in the news. This year, a lot of people have heard about the American Rescue Plan. Last year, it was the CARES Act. So if you've heard about 5 bills and they're voting on about 1,000, you've missed 995 bills. And so that's really why, I created IssueVoter. And just to give a quick overview of how it works, you would first choose the issues that you care about, and then we send alerts before Congress is about to vote on those issues. Right now, IssueVoter covers legislation at the federal level, both House and Senate. And we translate bills into layman's terms and offer points from both sides. So one of the bills that Alex is going to, I think, talk about today, I will share how IssueVoter has summarized that bill. Alex, happy to have your feedback on that afterwards. But when an individual sends their opinion on IssueVoter, we do send it directly to their rep. We send it to the staffer in charge of constituent contact. And we make it really clear that this is not a petition. It's not a campaign email. It's not a form letter. It's not from an advocacy organization. It's an individual constituent that's taken the time to learn about the bill and send their opinion. And then we also offer a scorecard that helps match that individual's opinions with how their member of Congress actually voted. So this is a sample scorecard, but someone could look at this and see, my rep represents me 80% of the time or 20% of the time. And just to have that knowledge, which most people are not necessarily aware of. I've had people use IssueVoter and see that their rep represents them 100% of the time, and it just makes them even more excited about voting. And I've also had people see that their rep represents them, less than they would have expected. So we're a nonpartisan nonprofit, and it's something where I think sometimes people forget that just because their rep is a Democrat and they're a Democrat, or their rep is a Republican, they're a Republican, doesn't necessarily mean that their rep is voting, on the side of the bill that they would be on every single time. IssueVoter is not an organization advocating for direct democracy. That's why we have policy experts. That's why we elect our representatives. But without tools like IssueVoter, I think it's really hard to even stay in touch with more than the one or two bills that you're hearing about on the news. So this is just a way for people to, throughout the year, extend their civic engagement beyond the ballot box, beyond elections. We also do partner with other organizations. So we've created landing pages for 1% for the Planet, Rock the Vote, which helps their members, their communities also access issues and bills that they care about. And that is all. That is what IssueVoter does. To brag, a little bit, I would say something we're really proud of as a nonprofit is not only people using IssueVoter, but also we have people in all 435 congressional districts, all 50 states and DC using it. But we've motivated people to take other forms of civic action offline in their real lives. So we've seen that people who are using IssueVoter learn about new issues, are exposed to new viewpoints, start conversations about politics, are excited to attend town halls, register to vote, all of these other things that you can do. So that's also really exciting. So just a plug, if I may, Dave, I'd love for any of you listening to sign up for IssueVoter yourself. If you like it, please share it. And of course, I'm always open to introductions to organizations that might benefit from using IssueVoter or partner with us. And I will stop sharing my screen and also just share that, I'm really, really, really excited about today's discussion because, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, I just think that reminding people how policy really affects all of the issues that we care about is so important. And so with that, I am really excited to introduce our next speaker, Ian Madrigal. And Ian is the creative strategist, best known for a viral Monopoly Man appearances in Congress, shaming the DHS Secretary Kristen Nielsen out of a Mexican restaurant over child separation policy, and the literal troll of Mark Zuckerberg. Ian is also an attorney, organizer, filmmaker, and writer who has led national movements fighting corporate power through a racial justice lens. So with that, over to you, Ian.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I should add, in addition to all of that, I am also a member of the board of the Unfunded list. So very excited to be here and talk to Alex and Maria. Dave, were we gonna show a video or is that later? We're gonna do a little highlight reel for folks who don't know my work. So this is one of these Monopoly Man appearances. Enjoy.
Thing one tonight. You may have heard there was a hearing today on the Capitol with the CEO of Google, called by House Republicans on the Judiciary Committee, who've been looking into allegations of liberal bias online. Now, it started out as most hearings do. Google CEO Sundar Pichai entered a packed room, ready to face the assembled congressmen and women. But as soon as Pichai took his seat, the Monopoly Man settled in right behind him, over his left shoulder. Look at that. It's actually an activist named Ian Madrigal, who also appeared at a 2017 hearing on the Equifax data breach and at Mark Zuckerberg's Senate hearing in April, that time dressed as a Russian troll. The Monopoly Man put on quite a show over the course of today's 3-hour hearing, adding a monocle to the costume at one point, holding up a bag stuffed with fake money, and at one point he upgraded the mustache to a supersized mustache, and then the old 4 mustaches at the same time gag. But the Monopoly Man was actually not the most cartoonish character at today's hearing. No, that honor goes to most of the Congress people asking the questions. That's thing 2 in 60 seconds. If it wasn't already obvious from the fact that they called a hearing in the first place that the Congress people on the House Judiciary Committee really don't know how the internet works.
But I like that I even made it into that little photo up there. Yeah, so that's part of the work I do. I also have worked as a campaign director and legal and policy fellow, like lots of different things in this space. Monopoly Man actually kind of happened little bit by accident. It was like a fun gag I thought of for a campaign I was working on, pitched it to my bosses, was very surprised when they gave me permission to do it. And then it just went viral and was more effective than like the 2-year campaign that I'd been organizing. So now I went out on my own. I'm doing consulting and like creative activism on passion projects as well as for clients in these spaces. So yeah, would definitely love to talk about what I found to be effective in advocacy, as well as hear Alex's perspective. And I'll give Alex a little introduction without going too much into the bill that I know folks are interested in. But Alex Porter is tax counsel to Senator Angus King of Maine. Last month, Senator King introduced the bipartisan Accelerating Charitable Efforts Act, known as the ACE Act, which ensures donor-advised funds make resources available to charities in a reasonable period of time. So very relevant to all the folks here, I'm sure. And I will hand it off to Alex real quick if he wants to say anything else, and then we'll just start asking some questions.
Sure, thanks very much for the introduction. And I'm Alex Porter, I'm Senator King's tax counsel. I'm definitely quite involved in supporting his efforts on the ACE Act and in other areas of tax and in many other portfolios. We wear a lot of hats around here, but tax is my home policy-wise. So basically everything I do has some sort of tax aspect to it. Excited to be here today to speak with you all and look forward to your questions.
Great, well, I can kick us off. And oh, Jane, do you have?
I was just going to ask, at what point is there, are the rules, are the tax breaks for philanthropic giving going to change? Because I know, you know, as I said before, I'm starting to do a lot of estate planning and sort of wonder, you know, I know that political contributions never did count, which I think is a good thing. Although, you know, the Citizens United makes that sort of a difficult question. But how is that going to affect, and will it affect, I guess you're on the tax side, not on the, you know, on the fundraising side, but will changes to the tax code be in the offing, and will they affect fundraising?
Yeah, I'll take that question, and thanks very much for it, Jane. You know, I think that a very important figure that you've got to look at is a kind of stable figure of to look at charitable giving as a size or a piece of the economy. And there's been some commentary, in fact, on how it's been a very stubborn 2% of gross domestic product for the last 40 or so years, regardless of what Congress has done to charitable giving incentives and you know, laws on the federal level. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 really changed things in terms of the number of people to whom the charitable deduction is available. I believe that it's somewhere in the realm of 7% of Americans now who can actually take a tax deduction for charitable giving. That's actually before the CARES Act passed last year, which actually had a $300 universal charitable deduction, above the line deduction. So, you know, even if you're a non-itemizer, in other words, you can take the deduction. But in general, without that emergency effort, which is in effect for this year as well, the number of people who actually receive a tax benefit from charitable giving is remarkably small. Now, I'm not saying that the amount of charitable dollars that are given that are subject to the deduction is small, because in fact, a lot of people who are giving are actually quite wealthy and generally are in the itemizer column. So you're getting above the standard deduction most of the time if you're funding a private foundation, for example. So, you know, if you're Mackenzie Bezos, who's single-handedly driving up, which is, I mean, it's overall a good thing, but single-handedly driving up the percentage of GDP that's going to charitable giving in a year, you are almost certainly not taking the standard deduction, so that donation is worth something to you tax-wise. So to answer your question, your first question, I took them backwards, but your first question about where we're going from here, I am notoriously bad at reading tea leaves in terms of where Congress is going. There I can tell you what bills are out there. James Langford is leading a bill that would dramatically expand the universal charitable deduction to, I believe, somewhere in the $4,000 range per person, which would be about a third of the standard deduction. That's a tremendously expensive bill. There's no cost estimate as far as I've been able to tell on it, but it's universal charitable deductions, because they apply to everyone, which on the one hand is a really good thing to get everybody some sort of benefit from charitable giving. On the other hand, cost the government a tremendous amount of revenue, because if even at a 22% tax rate, every dollar that goes out to charity is being subsidized 22 cents by the federal government, if there's a universal deduction. There also, our act certainly would be a change in a fairly narrow area of the charitable sector, but one that's grown dramatically over the past 30 or so years. That's the donor advised fund sector. And, our bill, Senator King's bill and Senator Grassley's bill, would put reasonable limits on how quickly a DAF has to pay out a donation, and all appreciation off of that donation. And we believe it would raise some money, because there would be donations that are coming out faster, and so that provision could change things. But in terms of timing, it's anyone's guess. So I'm sorry to not be able to be more specific on that as to when there will be tax changes for individuals.
Thank you.
Anne, did you want to chime in?
I was going to say, since there's so few of us, I thought I would just do this verbally. But so I think the bill aims at donor advised funds specifically, but in whose interest is it to have the money just sit there and not go out? Like there's some weird incentive going on that I think it would be great to talk about, because who's benefiting from the fact that all this money is just being parked?
Well, money managers certainly are. They receive a fee off of whatever is in these accounts. The charity has to hire a money manager, and then the money manager, just like they would for any other account, is paid a market rate for managing the money that sits in a DAF. So that's how commercial DAFs are. That's where the incentive is for commercial DAFs, is in paying money managers essentially. You've got them through most of the major finance companies that you can think of are also running they have subsidiary charities that follow the letter of the law in terms of having independent boards and all of that, but invariably they hire their own finance company after whom the charity is named to manage the money, and that's not an accident. In terms of community foundations, who are the other major DAF holders, their incentive to hold them is that they also receive fees off of DAFs that often are far higher than what a commercial DAF will charge, and they use those fees in some cases to go toward the general charitable purposes of the community foundation, which isn't a bad thing. We have a carve out in the bill for smaller DAFs, if you call under $1 million small. But it is, for some community foundations that are holding DAFs that, are 35, 45, $50 million. So $1 million on that scale is small. And so, we don't want to hurt, the Senators King and Grassley don't want to hurt the community foundation mission, where DAFs, by the way, began anyway over 100 years ago. They generally exercise a lot better DAF hygiene than other DAF sponsors, and is certainly, generally will provide really in-depth donor advice to say, hey, like, here's a project in Aroostook County, Maine, that we think you might be interested in obligating some of your DAF donations toward. And that, generally ends up, in a positive donor relationship that pops money out into the communities, which was the initial reason for having DAFs in the first place. So, I'd say, to kind of go back to your original question of, who benefits? Well, commercials, there are fees that are paid. That's where the benefit is. And, community foundations, the community foundation and its, general fund likely benefits. And they too hire money managers, but that's not their main, thrust. It's toward, perpetuating the mission of the community foundations, which is a noble thing to be doing.
Mike,
Thanks.
I'd like to ask the next question if I could. So I was in 2018, I was running a nonprofit, and I know that the Senate was considering the tax bill, which passed. I don't believe the senator voted for it, if I recall correctly. I was disappointed that an organization called Independent Sector, which owns a building down the street from us, a very well-funded, large nonprofit, whose mission is to advocate for nonprofits. If I recall correctly, their position was that there should be no new regulations on donor advised funds. And I think Council on Foundations said the same. And in general, I think the reason is because their clients are large donors, and they wanted to be able, and large donors like the flexibility. Are you hearing from any groups so is that still the position of the large groups lobbying for our sector, that there shouldn't be regulation? Are there any advocacy groups, particularly influential ones, that you folks are hearing from, pushing for changes?
Well, I think there's a kind of X factor that didn't exist before in terms of DAF reform. You've got a coalition called the Initiative to Accelerate Charitable Giving, which I'm sure a number of you have heard of. And, there had been rumblings about DAF reform, certainly in the 2017 tax bill. One of the original proposals was to have a 5-year payout rule, and that came from the Republican Ways and Means Committee. So this has traditionally been kind of bipartisan push to get more money out faster to real working charities. It's not, really a Democratic thing or a Republican thing. There have been folks from both sides who have said, if the government is subsidizing charitable donations, which in almost all of the cases that are using DAFs, they do, because especially after 2017, when one of the strategies that estate planning lawyers, me being a former one, I can tell you this strategy that emerged to get middle-class people above that standard deduction to make the charitable donations count for tax purposes, was to say, like, if you have the means to give a $50,000 donation in 1 year, and then it's so that in that 1 year, 40,000 or so is above the charitable deduction or the standard deduction level. So you take advantage for tax purposes of that $40,000, do it so that in that year, you're getting a tax benefit for all of the charitable giving that you put into that DAF and then pay out over 5 years. And so, you're looking at people who, have some means generally who are using this. And so, your original question here was, are there, large charitable sector organizations that have come out in favor of it? I'd encourage you to take a look at the number of supporters of the initiative. It's actually, fairly broad and growing. But in terms, the Philanthropy Roundtable, the Council on Foundations, the, independent sector, and group of community foundations that's represented by Jeff Hammond, they've all, come out against this legislation, which we view as somewhat unfortunate. But, that doesn't mean that there isn't support from the charitable community. We've received a number of letters from individual charities and funders who are in favor of this legislation, and have really seen no direct outreach from public charities that you'd imagine, you think of when you think of a charity, saying, oh no, please don't do this. There is research out there showing that the mainline charities that you would think of have lost out on billions and perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars over the last 5 years that have been socked away instead into perpetual vehicles. So this would have a really broad positive effect on the broader charitable sector in terms of making sure that a donation that goes in today plus its appreciation is paid out to a charity in 15 years. I think it's pretty reasonable, given that if you gave $1 to a charity today, they could spend it tomorrow. And what's the opportunity cost of holding that dollar in an account for 15 years? It's all of the appreciation and all of the good work that could have been done with that dollar tomorrow. So that's probably diverged just a little bit from your question, but tried to.
Oh, that was very helpful
in there as well.
So I know some people at all of the various organizations you mentioned that have come out in opposition, and I will diligently get in touch with them to express my disappointment. And it is disappointing to hear that. I mean, they're supposed to be advocating for us, and it's not. This isn't the first time I think they've came down on the wrong side of something. But I kind of understand how it happens, and we need to make our voices heard. If Unfunded List had a larger budget, we would have people that you'd be hearing from regularly. But unfortunately, right now, it's all we can do to review grant proposals. But I do have free hours that I can use to send angry emails, and certainly I will encourage everybody else to do it. And I'll check out whatever I can do through IssueVoter on the bill as well. I want to ask a question for perhaps both Alex and Ian. Ian, some of the issues you've done the creative activism on, like I was saying, alluding to earlier, like not, I guess you could say they're not sexy, right? They're not something that the average American cares a great deal about, is what I mean by that. I think you had to explain it to me many, many times, the Wells Fargo thing. And like right now, I don't even remember. I don't really remember. Talk to me a little bit. Working on issues that aren't like right now, like there's infrastructure bills, the ones that get really up there and everything that people get very excited about. And they're on the news much more often. Talk about working on something like this, right? I think the average American probably can't define a donor advised fund. Probably not. I don't really know too many average Americans. But you've had to do this before on similar issues that aren't really getting all kinds of attention. Right. Who should we dress up as for this one, I guess?
I think Monopoly Man applies to a lot of different situations.
He would enjoy the tax benefits for sure.
Yeah, he would not be distributing funds to charity. Yeah, I mean, I think I'll answer more generally, and then maybe Alex can talk more about this bill. But in general, like when I was doing Monopoly Man, I was working on the issue of forced arbitration, which basically is every time you click yes on those like terms and agreements that you never read, they often include what's called an arbitration clause, which just says that if you have any dispute with the company, you have to go into a private system that they pay for. They like basically are able to pick who judges your case. And so obviously like the deck is stacked against the consumer. and you don't have any right to sue them in court with all of your constitutional rights and things that we kind of take for granted will be there when something goes wrong. So yeah, a huge problem with that issue was messaging around it. If you say the word arbitration, people's eyes glaze over. Believe it or not, forced arbitration was actually already a way that they tried to make the term more understandable before it was pre-dispute mandatory binding arbitration or something terrible like that I'm sure the other side came up with just to make it awful, just like they changed the name of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. But anyway, yeah, so a huge issue was messaging that. And the way that Monopoly Man was born actually is that we found that one of the best ways to describe it to people in a way that actually made sense was a corporate get out of jail free card. And so we went with the Monopoly imagery. And, you know, to be honest, I think because we were really diligent about whenever someone was talking about the Monopoly Man appearance to be like, by the way, this is the issue we're working on, and then directing people to the website, I think we got more attention on forced arbitration than would have been possible in any other scenario. But also a lot of people didn't necessarily know exactly what issue we were there for, but still, you know, it resonated, like the imagery. It was clear that we were against the corporation and for the little guy. And so even that kind of broader message helped our campaign.
So I'm going to just talk about messaging a bit as well. And I think that part of the problem with ideas that seek reform is, you know, first you've got to explain, you know, we who are conceiving of the ideas and helping our bosses, you know, who are conceiving of the ideas, you know, we deal with all of the complexity every day, and we're capable of doing that, and it's our job. And you know, so you've got to understand what the problem is. You've got to, you know what the solutions, potential solutions are, what the potential problems with the solutions are, you know, arguments, counter arguments, you know, a lot of complexity. And our government is complex and our world is complex. But people generally, and I think Maria gets this, you know, your statistic about, you know, distilling down hours of work into 30 seconds, you know, that is what the voter needs, is that, you know, voters don't live and breathe government every day. They, you know, they want to have a real meaningful stake in their government. We live in a democracy and they should. But we need to be able to, policymakers in particular and advocates need to be able to communicate what are really complicated policies in a simple sentence. I'm a big believer in the simple sentence. Senator King is a master at the simple sentence. And he's a really smart guy and doesn't condescend and doesn't, you know, dumb down ideas. He gets to their essence. And, you know, for this bill, for example, if, you know, you read the articles that he's quoted on, you know, his, you know, one line on this bill is, charitable dollars should go to charity. It's a simple sentence. And that is something that we need, you know, advocates and policymakers, you know, when they're most effective, they're talking most directly to the voters and in a very simple way about how policies impact their lives. So, you know, if I could offer a global, you know, takeaway for today, not just about charitable bills or any other bills, you know, you all are advocates for policies. And as much as you can distill messaging down to a simple sentence, you know, I think, you know, that's really important. So it's kind of my 2 cents that is not directly related to charitable bills, but how Senator King is messaged this particular bill is emblematic of that.
Yeah, I would also just add that, you know, I think the reason that we have all these very complicated terms, like obviously tax laws are complicated for good reasons, but also really, I think just to create loopholes for corporations and things like that. So a lot of times we'll find that like the messaging that we're trying to figure out how to make sexy is unsexy because our opponents made it that way so that it's hard to talk about. So I think oftentimes using different terms, like coming up with our own language instead of using what is there, at least when we're talking about messaging to the public, can be super useful. And I really just encourage folks to try out different things, tell your friends and family who aren't involved in the political world about it, and see what resonates with them. Because a lot of finding that good message is just actually talking to folks and seeing what people understand. I think a lot of the folks that work on it, even if they don't have, nefarious motivations, a lot of these folks are lawyers or policy wonks or whatever it is. And so that's the way they talk. And we have to find different ways to talk to the public rather than try to, explain all the intricate details to folks that don't really have time to get there. But with that, I want to switch a little bit to advocacy. We can still keep asking questions about the bill, but I'm curious from Alex's perspective, and then also Maria's from a different angle, is just, we've seen this proliferation of direct grassroots congressional advocacy with models like Indivisible and IssueVoter. For Alex, I'm wondering, how has that affected your office and what approaches you find most and least effective? And then I guess for Maria, kind of the opposite of that, of like, what have you learned in the process of IssueVoter that's like most and least effective, and how has that changed your view going forward?
So in terms of constituent contact, whenever Senator King's, considering an official action, be it introducing legislation, co-sponsoring legislation, writing a letter, joining a letter, or making a public statement, he's very responsive to his constituents and wants to know, how the policy or the action will affect the people of Maine and whether it's in their best interests. And in terms of constituent contact, sometimes these are very narrow issues where, you'll contact someone, let's say, it's a nonprofit issue. I know the executive director of the Maine Association of Nonprofits, and I can, contact her. And I also know individual nonprofit leaders in Maine and can contact them to determine, how an action would affect, folks in our state. It's a kind of a blessing that it's a small state. He often says Maine is a one town with a big long Main Street, because people know each other. Jane would agree, Dave would agree, I'd imagine. So that's very important. In terms of correspondence, I have a guy who worked for me in before law school. I did his job for the defense portfolio for Senator King, who his full-time job is monitoring the correspondence in my issue areas that the senator receives. And he will process thousands of emails and to a lesser extent phone calls and physical letters per month. And if there's a hot button topic, the senator really is going to want to know where the balance of of correspondence is, what the typical writer is saying about the issue. And he is very engaged in drafting correspondence to respond to folks who have written in to him regarding policy positions. And then, even separately, if someone is having trouble with a federal agency, he has a whole constituent service team who are really amazing people who work day in and day out to get people help with federal agencies and kind of cut through the red tape that exists. So, whenever a constituent service request comes in our areas, we forward it to them, but also often, are called in to advise from a policy perspective as well. So, from the Hill side, that's what we're seeing and what the senator is seeing. Hopefully that's helpful.
I'll chime in with something exciting that when I first started IssueVoter, a lot of people were really surprised. I was surprised that they were surprised that when they contact their reps and senators, that every contact is tracked. And I would tell people, every time you reach out, it's tracked, it's tallied, it's counted, it's kind of like put into their system. And at that time, about 4 years ago, some people didn't know that. But I do think more and more now today, people do realize that when they reach out, it's going to get some kind of tracking applied to it. So I think that's great. I've also told people, and I would love to hear Alex's point of view on this, but I've also told people that, like he mentioned, there are many channels that you can contact your reps and senators. And I try to tell people, it's like, I don't think necessarily advocate for one channel over the other. I mean, of course, I'd like people to use IssueVoter, but I mean, whether you email or pick up the phone or, send a fax, it's kind of a tally mark at the end of the day, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. It's not like you call and you're going to get 10 tally marks, but if you email, you only get one. And so I've told people that, and I've also told people to try to connect it to a specific piece of legislation if they can. Because I've also know a lot of times constituents will call and they'll just rant, which, they're frustrated and, that's understanding. And the staffer will listen, or the intern, they'll listen to that rant and they'll be polite, but it's not as helpful to hear someone rant for, 30 minutes about an issue as it might be for, in my opinion, for the office to hear, I am for HB or Senate bill, something. How does the senator plan to vote on it? And by the way, I'll be tracking that vote. I'll be watching that. And so I think those hopefully are more impactful. But Alex, yeah, I'd love for you to hear your reaction to that.
Yeah, I generally agree. Having kind of grown up professionally, doing that, have been the intern on the other end of the line. Like, you're absolutely right. You could take up 30 minutes ranting about something, and that's fine. And that's, the staff is there to listen. That's their job. And but in terms of actually making an impact, you're not going to make more of an impact over 30 minutes on one issue, and perhaps can make less if you don't connect it to actual, legislation moving, and are just like, I'm angry about charities, and that's all that you would say. And sorry, I keep going back to that, but that's the theme of the day. So rather just keep it all in one theme. If you said instead, I'm for passage of the ACE Act, and here's why. And also, if you happen to be like someone who's, providing a story that is really good backup for whatever legislation it is, or against any legislation that it is, could be something that, the intern or staff assistant, sits up and takes notice and puts a note down. And you might end up getting a call back from the staffer who's actually advising the senator on that policy, later on, because often they do look for stories that, I've seen stories become the body or the meat of a floor speech. I've seen, stories inform policy positions before. So, that is probably the absolute most effective that a phone call or email could be. So yeah, I just hopefully that's helpful. But yeah, I'd agree, Maria. It doesn't generally matter if you're you just want to leave a comment basically on a piece of legislation, either for or against. The best way is to just email, phone, hard copy mail. They're all going to be counted the same, and they will be counted for or against whatever it is.
Can I just say that as a retired person, I have plenty of time to make angry phone calls. And I swear to God, Senator Richard Burr and Senator Tom Tillis hear from me. And they heard from me this morning because I actually applauded them for voting in favor of advancing the infrastructure bill. Usually I'm not so laudatory. But you know what? I just get, frankly, BS responses, and they vote the party line. And the same thing happened. I must admit, I used my Colby address to during the impeachment trials to try to contact Susan Collins, And, you know, she's concerned and she's disturbed, but she votes the party line. So I'm not, I mean, Senator King's another matter. He's a horse of a different color. But do you think, you know, in today's political scene, that they really are listening to constituents? Because it seems to me that they vote the party line, or they, you know, when it comes to primary time, they, you know, look to Mar-a-Lago or Bedminster. I mean, where are we really now in the sense of, you know, real representation of constituents?
I think it depends often on whether you're in a competitive state. You know, Maine is historically been a very purple state, at least in the last, you know, 30 or 40 years. And my perception of, you know, Maine politicians is that though they may end up voting one way or the other, they, you know, really do care which way the correspondence is going, and also you know, what they've heard from, you know, leaders that they respect in the community there. You know, in states where, you know, it's less competitive and a Democrat is always going to win, they have less incentive to listen to folks from the other side, because, you know, although they are their constituents, you know, they know that those people are never going to be voting for them anyway. And, you know, voting the party line has distinct benefits for them, because they're less likely to get primaried. So I'd say it's a kind of it depends answer, and that the impact of constituent correspondence probably goes up depending on whether you're in a more purple state than in a more deep red or deep blue state.
Thanks. Can I ask a question? Because and I'm sorry, I missed some of the giving vehicles talk yesterday.
Mom, can you wait? Can you go after Margaret?
Sorry, our sound wasn't turned on.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Margaret has been waiting for a couple.
Yes, I can wait.
That's okay. Hi, it's Margaret. I'm with Unfunded List. And I was just curious, your all's comments around better funding of the IRS. It is something that came up in several of the panels yesterday, especially when we were talking about C3s and C4s and following certain regulations and going after them for not following those regulations. And then, how long does it take to get your C3 status? These are questions a lot of folks have. And, we were discussing the pros and cons of better funding the IRS, and would it lead to, increased surveillance, but then maybe longer wait times for other things. So I'm just curious, the panelists' ideas and comments on their pros and cons as they see them for better funding of the IRS.
Thanks so much for the question, Margaret. I'll jump in right away, just because other than the ACE Act, IRS tax gap closure has been Senator King's other huge priority in my issue area. So I've kind of, along with charitable reform, I've kind of lived and breathed tax gap closure over the past 8 months or so. And he was on the one hand, really happy to see the bipartisan infrastructure deal happening. He often says, I like to quote my favorite philosopher, Mick Jagger, you can't always get what you want, but sometimes if you try real hard, you get what you need. And what he wanted was part of it to be paid for by IRS tax gap closure efforts. And that ended up being too much to stomach for the Republicans, who got absolutely skewered by conservative groups. I don't know if I would if conservative is the right word, but there were outside groups that started a really vocal campaign to stop them from including the tax gap pay for. In terms of what needs to be done. The IRS needs significantly more mandatory funding over the next 10 years or so. The bill that Senator King introduced, which is the only Senate bill on tax gap closure, has Senators Kane and Brown as co-sponsors, would provide $80 billion over the next 10 years in mandatory funding. So it's not subject to annual appropriations. It is going to be given. And also has a comprehensive financial service provider reporting requirement, which would which actually would account for most of the money raised by the bill, which, by the way, would be somewhere in the $700 billion range over 10 years on net. I mean, it's 780 that would come in, 80 would go out, but we would have 700 billion more dollars in the federal treasury. And the vast majority of that doesn't actually come through increased enforcement efforts. It comes from the behavioral effect that happens when people know that the IRS knows that their deposits and withdrawals to their total, like let's say you have $100,000 of deposits and 120,000 of withdrawals over a year, just those numbers, not the individual numbers, would be reported on a new 1099 from your brokerage account or your bank account or your cryptocurrency account to the IRS. And the goal of that really is to catch pass-through businesses that are engaging in underreporting of their tax liabilities, and they make up 52% of the tax gap, which has been estimated at between $660 billion and $1 trillion a year. So this would close it a bit, but this would only get a part of it. But a part of it is $700 billion, and it makes our society more fair in terms of, a lot of this has some safeguard. The bill doesn't have anti-political targeting on it, but generally all appropriations do. And so, going after exempt organizations for heavier audits, that's not the focus of this bill. It's really to go after pass-through entities, high net worth individuals, and get the audit rates for the biggest of the big corporations, the ones with above $20 billion in assets, which used to be virtually 100% audited every year. It's fallen by almost a third, and get that back up to 95%. So, the focus is a little bit different than what you're suggesting but we're talking about a lot of overlap, I think, in terms of the increased visibility and the increased revenues, which just, I pay my taxes, you pay your taxes. If you make a salary, your tax compliance is generally in the realm of 99%. Those aren't the people who are really cheating the government. It's folks with low visibility income, and increasing that visibility through more audits and better IT for the IRS, which, by the way, their mainframe goes back to 1969. I mean, it is absolutely atrocious how little we spend on IRS IT when the major banks, will spend the IRS's entire budget on IT in a year. So, it's in any case, I've rambled a little. This is a huge priority for my boss. And, I think that if there is a reconciliation bill, it's an item that he's already signaled he wants to see included in full. And I see Ann's comments about the IRS aggressively targeting EITC recipients. The EITC is the Earned Income Tax Credit. It's actually a Republican idea by Milton Friedman to have a negative income tax for the least fortunate in our society. And those folks get audited like crazy. And it's because it's really cheap for the IRS to audit them. They don't have the legal resources that the real cheaters, who generally are very high net worth individuals, have to fight the IRS until it just throws up its hands and goes home. The EITC folks just generally roll and will pay up whatever the IRS says they owe. And that's, in my boss's view, they've got enforcement upside down. Sorry, a mosquito that got in here. But that's, the EITC audits are a travesty, and we need to turn the system back upside down to where it should be and where it was, frankly, heading toward in 2010 before IRS cuts started in earnest. I mean, the enforcement budget's down 25% in real terms since then.
But we spoke yesterday about family foundations, in particular, the former president's family foundation. As you may know, he lost his status. It was New York State that did that investigation, pulled it away. One thing we talked about yesterday is that the various grifts were quite plainly evident in the IRS's public 990s that they make available. And I'm wondering if a better funded IRS might be able to more closely look at family foundation, because it is kind of common, particularly like family foundation will purchase a ticket to an event, right? And then allow the members to attend the event, which you're not allowed to do, but it happens a lot, right? Would there be, is some of this, is it possible to raise more revenue or get more money out to working charities if by having the IRS take a closer look at family foundations, private foundations?
Well, that kind of intersects between the two bills that we've been talking about. There's a provision in the ACE Act that would prohibit family foundations from paying paying salaries to family members or for family member travel. You can do out the math and, paying 5 family members and taking a board retreat to Hawaii, you can generally get almost all the way to a 5% payout requirement, because by the way, those are considered administrative expenses that you can subtract from the amount that you actually need to pay out to charity, which is generally 5%. So, you can do out the math on a $10 million private foundation and see, just how possible it is to use it kind
They're putting
of
travel towards their 5%.
Well, board member travel, you can.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, let's stop that.
A family member can be a board member, and you can pay for board member expenses, right? So
I knew it happened. I just didn't think it went towards the 5%. That sounds just wrong.
Yeah,
I hear a lot of people that want to see the 5% raised.
Yeah, that's one thing that the ACE Act would prohibit, and then you go to better IRS enforcement, and I think that depending on whose version you look at, I mean, ours leaves a lot of discretion to the IRS in terms of where they would spend those enforcement dollars, but they certainly could help resource the nonprofit division, and if there was a particular, often, practically, how do you find out about these things? Generally a tip from somebody. I mean, it's very difficult, through a 990, if, you're relying on self-reporting basically to find out about stuff that people really want to hide. But, if, there's a tip that basically says, well, look at this foundation where somebody, paid for, salaries to 5 family members and had a board retreat in Hawaii. That's somewhere where an auditor could really check in on that if the ACE Act in fact passed and outlawed that sort of activity. So that's something that we could look at.
If there are other questions in the chat, or
Can I do one quick one? What about charitable annuities? Like the colleges and universities, I'm constantly getting asked, and actually my mother did it. You give a bunch of money, and then the college holds the money and then pays you an annuity based on some actuarial, tables. Do you think those are legit? I always found them a little suspect.
I can't really comment on them because I don't really know enough to comment on them.
That goes to the issue of the money that was supposedly given not actually being used until the person, who gave it dies. so that, money can just sort of sit there for a
Yeah,
while.
again, I'm not familiar enough with the vehicle in order to comment on it. I think a lot of colleges and universities, though, very zealously guard their nonprofit status, which would be at risk if they conducted fraudulent activities. So, I do know that these gift annuities are fairly common practice, but I don't know enough about it to really comment, or else I'd give you my take, but I unfortunately don't, and I'd be remiss if I did.
Okay.
They are, it's, I know a little bit about it. We were talking about planned giving is what Mom's asking about. I'm kind of 50-50 on it. I think there's probably, if someone really know a lot about the details, there's probably some ways that it could be made better. It is pretty much only very large institutions like Harvard, right, that has, huge endowments and wealth managers, money managers, people with that kind of knowledge that can raise money in this way, which is very beneficial to them. It's very beneficial to Harvard to have a planned giving program. It's a very large portion of what they raise. But hardly any of the proposals we read, even from some of the larger groups, are able to do it, which makes it just harder for newer nonprofits to break into fundraising. Out of curiosity, Sarah, Mary's saying it's a medium-sized nonprofit. Are you able to have a planned giving program?
Not yet.
Not yet. So this is a nonprofit with a $70 million annual budget that is not able to yet pursue planned giving. So like it's kind of a really high barrier of entry. It's just my general thought on it. It's not particularly relevant to most of the proposals we read because of how difficult and tricky it would be. Which is similar to it's similar to some of the other issues we've been talking about, right? And just related to the fact that in general, if the corpus is large, you can make money off of fees. And there's just a lot of people in the world interested in making money off of those fees. Or it's not necessarily wrong, right? As long as money is also getting to charities and helping people. Anyway, thank you very much for all of your work on these issues. There's something that, like I said, not necessarily sexy Americans, but that I care a great deal about, and that I'm sure most of the folks listening today and involved with Unfunded List care a great deal about. We planned to attend one that we've asked a bunch of difficult questions. I hope you ate your brains through this morning and your Wii's and everything. Thank you very much. Look forward to following these bills and seeing how things go. Congratulations on, I haven't read too much about it, but I saw headlines. There's been movement on infrastructure. I guess it's infrastructure week.
Finally.
Anyway, thank you very much. It's been a real honor to have you join us. As Mom mentioned, I grew up in Maine. He was governor when I was in high school. You don't have to tell him that, that'll make him feel old. But I've been a big fan all my life. He got us through the ice storm and several other storms after that. So thanks very much for joining us. Thanks very much, Ian, for your board service, and Maria for your, Maria's on our Knowledge and Procedures Committee, is very helpful there and has sent proposals in the past. Everyone should follow all of our panelists' work. They're doing really cool stuff. We are coming back at 2:00 for COVID contributions and the post-mask ask.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
All right, we'll have about an hour-long break, everybody. We'll be back at 2:00.